Well, welcome, Shop Talk. Thanks everybody for showing up today. I think I've got a pretty fun presentation going here today, and I hope everybody's well out there. Hope everybody's healthy and happy. And I'll do the trivia question right out the front here. I think Ellen's here helping me too. She's kind of my producer and doing the filming and the back end work. But like everybody else, I kind of feel like two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl. So if you know the lyric and the artist and the song, send it in and we'll send you a gift for that. Two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl. All right, so primary, secondary, let's get right down to it here. We're gonna try and do the same thing where I've got some slides that I'll go through first and, shout out a question. We'll try and open the mic. If that works, we'd be glad to talk to you. If not, you can type in a question. I do have some of the pre-submitted questions here in front of me, and I think I've got most of them wrapped into the presentation. If not, Kevin will cue some of those up at the end, and then yeah, either type them in, or if you want us to open your mic and you want to chat with us, we'd love to do that. And if we get off topic, I don't mind. If there's something else that's on your mind, I know a few of the pre-submitted questions were a little bit off topic, but I mean, we're here to share the information, share the love, so to speak. So send them in and we'll
Well,
see what we can do. And if I don't know, I'll make it up. I mean, we'll get something here.
Bob, you have just ushered in a flurry of answers. So, Andrew Roberts, I've just unmuted you. Do you want to shout out the answer?
Hi, Bob. Pink Floyd, Wish You Were Here.
Yeah, exactly. And
Bravo!
actually, what was the show that was on? Was it Saturday Night Live or something this weekend that Miley Cyrus did a really good cover of that? So I think that's kind of where I got the idea this morning. Ellen was playing that. So if you like that song and like covers, go to YouTube. It's probably on there. So thanks. Yep, you're a winner. I'll send you. Yeah, I'll need your mailing address at some point. We'll send you a Caleffi gift. All right, so yeah, so this is basically where we've been and where we're going with the shop talk. We've done a couple before this, and we're going to keep them going as long as you folks want to tune in. We're going to come up with some other, I'm trying to make them interesting and different topics. I want to talk about buffer tanks. I want to talk about, in fact, on the back of my display, I've been working on a point of no pressure change demo that's going to be kind of unique and different, where I can switch on and off all these different things. I got a high pressure drop boiler on there that I can switch on, and you can see how the Delta P works on that. So that's coming up, and yeah, a lot of good topics that we've got in mind. So thanks for hanging in there. So, and yeah, thanks to my back end staff. Like I say, Ellen's here, and Mary's on the other end. She's up in Milwaukee. Kevin's up in Milwaukee. He's going to be fielding questions, and they've got the presentation. Vote of honest that we need the presentation on their computers. In case I break down, they should be able to just run with it. So here we go. Primary, secondary, back to primary, secondary school. And we didn't do an official donation tonight, but what we're going to ask everybody to do is your local food bank. Everybody needs a hand out there. So if you want to just take some canned goods or some stuff down to a shelter, a food bank, or something in your local town, we'd love to know that you're doing that. So, and yeah, put on social media if you want, and we're going to come back. We got tons of ideas for things to do for upcoming ones, anything from dogs to people to you name it. Everybody needs a hand out there. So I'm a dog lover, so we might do something for the SPCA or something like that next. So yeah, share the wealth with your pantry, or what you have to share. So additional resources for the topic today. I learned probably the most about this from Dan Holohan, and he wrote a book that's over on the left there, Primary, Secondary, Piping Made Easy. Really understandable, a lot of good graphics in there, just as, basic. Okay, I don't know anything about piping. Tell me about, and that's what Dan's good at. Tell me about primary, secondary. So in fact, I chatted with Dan a little bit this week to get a little background on where this started. He was an old B&G guy, so he knows a little bit more of the history on this. So I got some more names and dates that we'll talk about. Probably the Bible in our industry, if there is such a thing, would be Modern Hydronics. John Siegenthaler wrote this. This is, I think, issue or third edition of this. I think he's working on another one as we speak, actually. But great information on there. The math is in there. Obviously, Siggy likes to put numbers behind everything he talks about. So the math is in there, and some examples in there, and some good schematics, and some both how do I pipe it, and then how do I wire it? How do I size the pumps? Great information in there. And then hopefully everybody that's tuned in is getting the Caleffi hydronics issues. These are free. We'll mail them to your wherever, your home, your shop. Twice a year we come out with a topic. Next one will be on how to use like air source heat pumps, in lieu of a boiler. What do we have to do if we want to start morphing over to some fossil-free options? So that's going to be a good one. I know Siggy spent a lot of time putting that one together, so watch for that. And if you want some back issues, let us know. We've got most of them, except 1 and 2 are out of print right now because old information. We kind of updated that with 15, but yeah, these are some more additional resources. A lot of the slides that I'll be showing today come out of different hydronics issues that we've done over the years. It's hard to find a schematic or a boiler manual or anything that doesn't talk about primary secondary. I mean, it's still a thing in our industry. I think there's sometimes nicer, better ways to do it, but it's not going away. It has a lot of value, and I think as we go through these slides, you'll see, you know, the intent going back to 1954 when Gil Carlson kind of brought this to our attention and started talking about it, and you know, then we took it over at the residential level and kept going with it. So it actually goes back to the story that, as I understand it, from Dan Holohan. You never know with his stories. Sometimes they get bigger over the years. But he talked about Gil Carlson being an engineer with Bell and Gossett, and they were having a problem with a big apartment building somewhere, a high-rise building that. It was an old diverter tee system, like the old Bell and Gossett, not old, they still make them, the monoflow tees. And back in those days, they actually had a blue ring one, which was even more restrictive than the red ring ones we have now. They had a tighter orifice. And so this building was put together with those, and some of the branches, some of the distant units weren't getting enough heat. They just weren't working. So somehow Gil Carlson got on the job and got involved. He said, well, let's just put a circulator on those branches that aren't working and just pump it down there. If it's not going to go down there by itself with the flow through the monoflow tees, let's just add a circulator. And they did, and they got it all sorted out. And then he started thinking about that. He said, well, why don't we just use circulators, not even use the, you know, the monoflow tees? And that's, as I understand it, how we morphed away from or morphed into the primary secondary, and basically putting a circulator on that other branch so that you could move additional flow to where you needed it when you needed it. So some of the things that we need to know, now there are pros and cons, like any piping arrangement or system that you do out there. I'm going to show you the good news and the bad news, and we demoed some of that. And if we have to do it again behind me, I can show you some other things that can go wrong with primary secondary if you don't have it just right. And even if you do have it just right, there's some things that can sneak up on you and cause some problems for you. So at the end of the day, it's about the tees. So again, oops, it looks like 1953 is when he went out on that job to fix it. But that's what it was on this job, is just this monoflow tee. And so basically, when you have these on a system, you have a little flow resistant, basically where that ring is, that caused flow to go out to it. It wasn't enough, it wasn't working, and they just added circulators on these branches going out to the radiators, and that's how they fixed it. So it really did more from that system there. So there I am actually with the Carlson Holohan Award, which is a little system size that B&G developed years ago. And a lot of this kind of all comes together when we talk about the point of no pressure change, about expansion tank location, primary, secondary, the size of wheel. It all came out of some of these problems that Gil was seeing out there, and developed not only the concept how to fix them, but also a little calculator, how you could go on a job site with this little wheel and do a lot of you know, calculation, done a lot of troubleshooting, do a lot of things with it. So I think they're still available from your B&G rep if you ask them for one of those what we call a hard copy, the plastic version of that you can just, you know, use it like a circular slide rule. They do have an app now, you can see right down here at the bottom. So if you do like to do stuff on your phone instead of the old plastic wheel, that's something you certainly would like to have on your truck and learn how to use it, because yeah, there's a lot of power in that little wheel. And so I'm glad to have that award as the reciprocant this year. So, all right, so the bottom line is closely spaced tees. If you go to a job and they say, I pipe this primary secondary, and you're looking around and there's no closely spaced tees, I'm talking about two tees together with a close nipple, as close as you can get those together, the closer the better. That's how you have primary secondary. If one tee is here and one is somewhere else in the system, it's not a closely spaced tee, primary secondary, true primary secondary. And so the intention is here that we have a loop, and I'll tell you how you can decide which is primary and secondary. And that too is a little confusing, because I've heard different versions of which one of these is primary, secondary. But basically, you have a conveyor belt, let's call it. This loop right here goes around maybe the mechanic room, maybe it goes around the entire building. And anywhere that you want to take energy or heat off of that, or chilled water, it could be chilled on a cooling system, you put a couple tees closely spaced with a close nipple between them like this, and you put a little circulator pump here, and it's going to take flow off of this conveyor belt, take it out to the load. It's going to return that flow back to the conveyor belt. So you're just basically kind of sipping a little energy off of this loop as it goes around there. So this circulator would be sized for exactly what that load is, and that's all it has to do, is just cover this. It's not running the conveyor belt. It doesn't know what's going on down here. It's just going to pull out a certain amount of flow pull out that temperature and bring it back into the system. So that's it in a nutshell, primary, secondary. Now, knowing that there are some, I don't want to call them laws. They're kind of more best practices, I would say, about how to pipe this. You know, there's some distances you want to pay attention to. I have seen this thing get spread out to 18 to 24 inches, and they still work. Not as well as they should, and I'll show you what happens when they start to get too far apart. This distance here, the same thing. Ideally, you'd have 8 times the pipe diameter. If it's a 1-inch pipe, we want 8 inches there. Same thing with the center point here. We're showing 4D, no more than 4 inches between those with a 1-inch pipe. I have seen these tees where there's only a few inches upstream of them and they still work. What we're trying to accomplish here is having the least amount of pressure drop between these two tees right here in the center. I'd like to get that down to 0, which is theoretically impossible. Even a 1 gallon minute flow through that, you're going to have some resistance going through there. But as I can get that as close as possible to 0, then I won't induce any flow out these secondary branches going out here when the main circulator is running. So in theory, that's how it should work, and this is the what I would guide you to use for spacing. There have been some pre-manufactured panels over the years. I know Watts Radiant for years built panels where they had these tees all jammed into a space so they could make it fit on a 4x4 board. Robert Bean had a company that made little primary, secondary in a box. It was like a 18-inch square box that had a bunch of this jammed into it. So some of these best practices or rules of thumb here get thrown off the cliff, but the system can still work. But there's what I'd like to see if you've got the room to pipe it this way. Give yourself a little upstream dimension. Now, one of the questions, and this would probably be a good place to address, even from Wheels, he said, how much distance here so this flow goes from turbulent to laminar? And guess what? It's always going to be turbulent flow unless you change flow to a real low number. And I think the example I used last week is you'd have to get down under 2 gallons a minute through an 1.25 inch pipe for that flow to truly go laminar, where it goes through like a bunch of little arrows going through the pipe instead of corkscrewing or tumbling through that. So this distance, the same thing with those old scoop type air purgers. People think that 18 inches upstream of that is to make it go laminar. It's not going laminar. The only way the flow transitions from turbulent to laminar is you got to slow it down. What does happen here is any bubbles and stuff with an air purger, the bubbles can start to rise to the top of that pipe, and that's a good thing for an air purger. And the other thing that happens when you come around a fitting, in fact, I found a really good graph of this online today. I meant to put it in here. When you go around an elbow, the water will start to tumble a little bit like that. It's not the same thing as going from laminar to turbulent, but you will get a little bit of kind of I don't know, like an eddy effect or something like that, when a wave comes in and it pulls some sand back out with it. So that's why we want a little bit of upstream distance there to just get any, condition that could cause flow to go out the branches. In this case, we want to get it out there. We'd like to have that, stream straightened, not going to go laminar, but it is going to straighten out is probably a better word to describe that. So down here is probably a good example of where, a couple copper tees with just a close nipple in between them. That's good. What else on this one? Yeah, so that's the key to it.
And Bob, if I can ask you a question from
Yeah.
Bill D'Agostino, if a person undersizes their secondary circulator, could it be possible not be able to overcome the head loss and instead go into the primary loop side and push through circulators with built-in check valves?
Well, if the secondary, well, first of all, let's define what we're calling the primary and secondary. And so I've seen different people explain it different ways, and I cleared it up the best I can with Holohan today. He said the secondary circuit is always the one that has the expansion tank in it. It's not about the run of the tees. Just because the run of the tees happen to be on this loop here doesn't make it necessarily the primary loop. And if this expansion was up here on this loop here, then that would be the primary. Now, I've heard people say, well, it's always the one with the boiler in it. Well, not here in this picture right here. The boiler isn't called the primary loop because the expansion tank is here. So whether, I don't know if somebody gets to say that officially, but that does make the most amount of sense, especially when we start talking about the point of no pressure change and how the expansion tank connection in the loop establishes that. So that's the first thing. So let's call that the primary loop. So if that's the case, and we're calling these secondaries, now if this circulator was undersized, basically you just won't get enough flow out to your heat emitter and you won't get the heat, which is on my next slide. Actually, if you know what the load is out here, this just needs to be sized for the pressure drop in the load here. Now this circulator needs to be sized to supply enough GPM to all these loads. So let's say these added up to, I don't know, call them 10 GPM each I'd need to have a circulator can move 30 gallons a minute around this conveyor belt loop all the time, so each one of these can pull off its 10 GPM without starving. So if this pump was undersized, yeah, then you would have the same issue where even if this this pump was perfectly sized, if I don't have enough flow going, especially when all of them are calling at once, I would starve it there. So yeah, in a perfect world, you always size the pump for the load, for the conditions on it. That being said, this is a pretty tricky circulator to size, because think of this loop right here. Let's say this is just in your basement, in your mechanic room, and let's say this is 6 feet long. So I've got maybe 15 feet of pipe. I've got 4 elbows in there. I've got some straight run T's. I don't have a lot of pressure drop in that circuit, but let's say I've got to get 30 gallons a minute going around there. Try and find a circulator that could move, 30 gallons a minute at 5 feet ahead going around that loop right there. So it was a weird circulator to go out and source, and obviously they got oversized because we need to assure that we had the GPM flow rate. So sometimes we ended up with a bit more head than we needed on this circulator here just to get the GPM we needed. I don't know that anybody to this day makes a 30 gallon a minute, 4 feet ahead circulator, at least not on the sweet spot mid-third, the curve that would run at. So I think that answered the question. Let's see if there was another pre-submitted one that, yeah, we talked about the laminar flow after an elbow, the injection tees. I think that clears that up. If not, ask me again, but that's, so this is what we called a series primary secondary. And what I mean by that is, let's say the water's coming out of this boiler it's a mod con, but let's just call it 180 degrees for the sake of this argument, coming around the conveyor belt. So my very first circuit here is going to get 180 degrees, right? And depending on what the temperature drop is going through that circuit, it's going to bring a cooler fluid back. And now that cooler fluid is mixing with this 180. I'm not going to get 180 to this one. In fact, we try and show that by how the color changes. So the red's my hottest water. What color is that? Whatever you want to call that, mauve or something like that. That's going to be a lower temperature there, and that's going to be a lower temperature. So when these first appeared in Vogue and all the trade magazines, everybody started doing this. Oh, this is a great way to do it. This is going to simplify all the problems that we have with multiple zones, and different size circulators won't fight with one another. We got a high pressure drop boiler here. I'll size that circulator just for that boiler, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. So it cleared up some of those issues, but we weren't taking into account this temperature drop. And this temperature drop could really get confusing, because what if this one was taking 180, coming back, let's call it 160. I'm blending here. Now this one's maybe down to 150. What if this one isn't running, but this one is? Now this one's going to see a different temperature than it would if this one was running. So this blending of temperatures was always changing. It was always moving based on how many different zones was going on there. So then all of a sudden in the magazines, the word came out, well, you guys got to arrange your temperature drops on this loop accordingly. So put your highest temperature load first, maybe an indirect tank, or you've got a high temperature baseboard loop, whatever it might be, air handler. Then your medium temperature next, and your lower temperatures as you go down. Well, what if I don't have that in my house? What if every zone in my house needs the same temperature water? How do I get there from here? Well, then it got a little bit more complicated. Now we had to do another little piping change in here to make that happen, which we'll get to next. So series primary loop, it's got some good intention, got some good things. It does cost you another circulator on every zone, on every boiler. I could have multiple boilers. I could have, this loop could go around an entire building, and I could pull off anywhere that I needed a load to come off of that. Or maybe I had another boiler at the end of the road somewhere that I want to inject into that loop. I could do that also. They didn't have to be clustered in one room like I showed in that example there. So let's put some numbers to this, and let's call the mixed temperature formula. So let's say we know that my secondary zone going off of this, it needs 21,000 BTU. And so I would, let's say I've got 170 degree water coming in that, I can just start layering in the numbers. So I can use the hydronic formula, and I know if I've got 21,000 BTU load out here, and I know I've got 4 gallons a minute through there, I can predict what that temperature drop's going to be. And there it is. Take your load, 500, the factor for water at room temperature times the flow rate there, and you can see what's coming back there. And so you can see I'm going to have about a 7 degree temperature drop going through that loop at that flow rate, moving that amount of heat. So now if I take the 7 off of 170, I'm going to have my next formula right there. My temperature in minus my delta T, so 170 minus 70, I'm going to have 163 degrees going to my next set of T's. Now, maybe that's enough, maybe it's too much, maybe it's just right, maybe I have to put a mixing valve on that, but you would have to go around that loop and do this calculation for every one of those drops as you go around there, so you know that if you get to the end of your your conveyor belt, that you still got enough energy to cover the loop that's on the very end of it. So we had to think that through a little bit tighter than just putting a bunch of T's in there and some pumps that were sized properly and crossing our fingers and saying, this should work. It's just like it shows in the magazines. What could go wrong? Well, that's what could go wrong. So I found this online. I want to thank Bornquist. This is on one of their websites from a trainer. Kind of shows it was a nice FEA finite element analysis of what happens between those closely spaced T's based on what's going on with the temperature coming in. Unfortunately, this is going the opposite direction of this drawing over here. But so we've got some flow coming in here at a given temperature. Some of that temperature is going out, some of that temperature is coming back, and some of it, if this flow was exactly this flow, nothing happens between the T's. So if I'm coming in here at, say, 4 gallons a minute, I got 4 gallons a minute going out to my loop, 4 comes in, 4 goes out, 4 comes back, nothing really happens here. So what'll start to happen if I've got 4 gallons a minute coming through my loop and only 2 gallons a minute going out to this loop, then 4 is going to come in, 2 is going to go out, 2 is going to continue through. This color would go away and it would turn to some other color in this graph based on the temperatures coming in here. So there's always something going on between these closely spaced T's as far as temperature blending, unless the flows are exactly the same, and then it's just basically taking a turn, going out to the loop and coming back to it. So it's good to know the numbers behind it. So if you do have to go and troubleshoot a system where they're saying, the upstairs bedrooms have never heated right in this building since we've lived here, what's going on? Well, if you got a loop like this and you go back and you start doing the math and say, well, you're only getting 120 degree water up there, you need 140 degree water, it's not going to happen. So yeah, Dan Watkins, thanks for that drawing. All right, so here's what we could do. We could take that loop, and what we could do is just put crossover pipes between them. I don't have to connect it anymore. I don't have to really have a series loop where it's like a conveyor belt with a pump moving it around there. So basically what I do now is I put these crossover loops, and that's going to assure that every one of these takeoffs now is going to see the same temperature water. Now, the best way to do that is you'd want to put a balancing valve on each one of those, and you'd want to balance this to whatever flow that's needed. And I'm doing that so by the time I get down to the end of the run here, I don't run out of fizz, run out of GPM, because it's all going to go across that crossover unless I choke that down to whatever that needs. So now I've kind of fixed my issue. I have fixed my issue with my temperature drop. It got a little bit more complicated as far as piping. Now I've got to put a crossover in. I should be putting a balancing valve in there. I got to define what these balancing valves need to be set at to make this right. I still got a lot of pumps going on here. I've got my boiler pump to assure I got flow through my high pressure drop boiler, if that's what you have there. I've got my my primary circulator that's going to move whatever the total of all these pumps is out to this end of this thing. So I've got flow going through here. It's going to balance out whatever this, let's call this 30 again, 10, 20, 30. I got 10 gallons a minute going through each one of those. So I still have the circulator, but I did solve my problem of the temperature drop. It cost me a little bit of more technology there. And notice as we go through these, I want you to pay attention to where I've got these expansion tanks connected onto these various drawings in there. And we're going to do a primary, secondary, and I'm going to show you why this tank has the most amount of benefit. When I've got a complicated piping system like this, you say, well, shouldn't the expansion tank be at the air purger? I've always put them at the air purger. Well, no, in this case, that would be exactly the wrong place because I'd be pumping at it. And the next question becomes, well, how do I assure that every pump in this drawing is pumping away from this expansion tank, point of no pressure change connection? I'm going to get to that in the next webinar. So that's kind of a teaser. I'll show you how you can predict what's going on in the circuit as it gets more and more complicated. And you'll see as we go through here, they are going to get a bit more complicated in the piping. Now, I see guys doing this all the time. I don't like to see anything between the closely spaced T's. And people say, well, I'll put a full port ball valve in there. What could that cost me? Well, here it is right there. Even a full port ball valve isn't going to be the same in ID inside that ball. In fact, I had a ball here somewhere I was going to show you. There's a 1-inch a ball valve, and it's not the same inside diameter as a 1-inch pipe. So there is going to be a little bit of flow resistance through this valve here. Now, will it be a problem? Well, maybe. What'll happen is we start putting resistance between these T's, some of this flow is going to want to go up this loop right here. Now, if I've got a check valve in here, I'll be okay. I won't have flow, but I did that little demo back here, and with no checks on this system, as soon as I start up this pump, you'll see movement in that secondary loop there. So don't be tempted to do that. I know why you do it. You do it to make it easier to purge that loop. So you can shut off a valve, purge this one, go to the next, and purge it. Simplifies the purging, but just put a Webstone, whatever brand you want to use, purge T right here, and you'll get a good clean purge out of that without having to put a resistance between your two closely spaced T's. And so if you look at that, the right way to know that is when we put a piping circuit together, we should count up everything in that circuit and come up with what's called the equivalent length. And what we do once we have the equivalent length of every fitting, every device in here, now we can assign the pressure drop to that circuit. And if you go through and you look at this here, I've got 2 ball valves in there. And if you look this up, I'll show you on the chart next. There's a couple 3/4 inch full port ball valves. They've got 2.2 feet ahead pressure drop through those ball valves. So right in this picture, I put 2 feet of pressure drop between my closely spaced tees where I want 0 pressure drop. So that is going to cause some issues with your secondary loop there. In fact, this is, I think I got this right off the Bell and Gossett site. Here's a, and there's a little number next to it. They say full port ball valve in a 3/4 inch size right here, 2.2 feet ahead. So, you know, anything you put between there, even if it seems benign like a full port ball valve, you're putting some resistance in there. And if you go and put a reduced port ball valve like this one right here, now you've got some of the charts show both a reduced port and a full port. Now you could be putting, you know, 4 feet ahead between those 2 closely spaced tees. So don't do it, I guess, is the key there, and keep them as close as possible. How are we doing for time? Yeah, this is looking good. Yeah. This is actually a primary loop I had in my shop here for a while. You know, I said, well, shouldn't the primary loop be a loop? So I took a piece of 1.25 inch K copper that was in a coil conveniently and just opened it up and managed to get a little circulator in here. And that's my loop circulator. And I found a little, actually a domestic water recirculation pump that had a low head, but pretty good flow rate. So I was just going through there, and then I just took my T-drill and just popped into here, put temperature gauge, pressure gauge, my air purger on the top. I could have done a little bit better with my point of no pressure change. That's what I did here, is I taken my expansion tank off, put a loop in there just to make it look weird. And my expansion tank's down here. This set of T's really, my pump is a little far away from that. I should have probably had my expansion tank connection in a little better spot, but again, that's before I understood the true meaning of the point of no pressure change when you start putting a lot of secondary branches in and how to make sure that you keep that established on every one of those connections. But I actually years ago made a delta T-shaped one where I made a triangle shaped primary loop, put my air purger on the top, and just because that's what I do when I get bored sometimes. So let's go beyond that and say, well, can't we simplify it a little bit? Why can't we make a primary secondary without having to have so many pumps? I said, yeah, sure you can. So let's call this one the horseshoe loop, because it is a horseshoe shape. And you notice what I've done here is I've taken my loads off as parallels, but I still have my closely spaced T's, so this still qualifies as a primary secondary. So I'm going to size this circulator to whatever NTI or whatever boiler brand you're using there tells you they want on that particular model and that particular type of heat exchanger. They're going to give you a couple choices on what the circulator needs to be based on what that flow requirement is on that. So now I've handled that. I've got the right circulator size for that load, and I've got my closely spaced T's. And as long as, now here's the key to this, as long as these pipes are generously sized, and I'll tell you what I mean by generously sized, every one of these pumps, and you can see I've got different size pumps here. Sometimes I'll put a Delta P pump in there just to make it even a little bit more complicated. As long as it's sized generously, my point of no pressure change, even though you say, well, your expansion tank's way far away from your pumps, that's not the point of no pressure change. Yes, it is, because this point of no pressure change establishes itself through this generously sized piping, through the closely spaced T's. This pump, even though this could be 30 feet away, whatever you want to call it, is still pumping away from the point of no pressure change, even though it isn't right here, as are these, because the point of no pressure change is established through this entire horseshoe. And by generously sized, I would size this piping right here so that when all these loads are calling on, let's call it 10, 20, 30, 5, 10, call it 40 GPM, I would want to size that pipe so that I've got about a 2 feet per second velocity going through that. I want to have a generously sized so I can establish my my point of no pressure change over that. So that would be, I don't know, maybe 2-inch pipe probably, I'm guessing at that. So that's what you want to make sure, that this piping here is sized to handle the flow rate of that at a low flow velocity so I can establish that point of no pressure change. And that's why we want to use numbers for some of this stuff. I know on the very first, maybe the first two that we did, I showed you how to use the pipe sizers that I pulled off of, I think, an engineering handbook. There's a lot of different pipe sizers online. The Copper Development Agency, Bell and Gossett circuit sizer wheel could size that for you, that could determine what size that pipe needs to be, as long as you know what those loads are. So What I did here is a couple things that I cleaned up is number one, I don't have a temperature drop. Every one of these is going to get the same temperature that comes into this tee right here. And the other thing is I took one pump out. I don't have a primary loop pump anymore because this pump is just moving the boiler circuit, and these pumps are going to move out to the distribution and back into it. So it freed up one circulator that was that odd, hard to size circulator to begin with. Taking a circulator, taking the cost of that out, taking the energy to run that circulator over the cost of the life of this building. So I've kind of cleaned it up, and I've actually solved two problems with one correction in my piping here, or not correction, but one different way of doing that as a parallel. And this one I'll call a moose antler because that's kind of what it looks like here to me a little bit. And I've done the same thing. You say, well, there's no loop at all. There's not even a horseshoe. There's nothing here. You just got a straight piece of 2-inch pipe, let's call it. And yeah, I still got primary, secondary. Why do I have primary, secondary? Because I still have a set of closely spaced tees in this piping circuit somewhere. So the exact same thing is going on here as the previous drawing. These all are in parallel to one another. So whatever temperature is coming in here is going to go out to all these. Now know that, let me go back to this one. It's probably a little bit easier to show it. This isn't necessarily going to be the temperature coming out of this boiler. See how I've got a red line here? Let's call that 180 degrees, even though it's a mod con. I probably wouldn't want to drive it at that condition. I'm still going to have blending going on between these tees. So coming in here at 180, I still have the temperature coming back from here that's blending with that. I still would want to calculate the flow rate going through that from the boiler and all the circuits here to know what this temperature is. Not going to be 180 degrees unless this flow into it was exactly the flow coming out of it. Not going to happen. So you're going to have to account for that temperature drop. Anytime you use a hydraulic separator, closely spaced tees, anytime the two flows can come together like that, you're going to have temperature blending, and you're going to have to define what that is and make sure that it does work for you. You can see the same thing here. The color of this line here is red because I'm taking 180 to it, and you can see my temperature coming back at a lower temperature. There will be some blending going across those tees. So then the question for you is, which is the primary loop? Knowing that I told you earlier that I am of the opinion, after talking with everybody I know, that wherever the expansion tank is connected into it, that becomes the primary loop, even though it's not even a loop anymore in this drawing here. It's just a straight piece of pipe with a bunch of parallel loads taken off and coming back into it. Still my primary loop because that's where my expansion tank connects into it. Now, if I put my expansion tank over here, which I wouldn't advise, and we'll get to that later, why I changed the point of no pressure change, isn't going to go through the small diameter pipe to these here, but then I would call that my primary loop if I moved my expansion tank over there, which wouldn't be a good thing to do, but that would, in my mind, change what we would call the primary loop as opposed to secondary loop by just moving the expansion tank connection, not the expansion tank itself. So what we did in hydronics number 19, I think it was, Kevin, if you can correct me if I'm wrong in that. We did a issue we called proven hydronic concepts. And what we tried to do is put 6 of the most common mistakes that we see over and over again as people send us drawings. We go out on job sites and visit them, and what are people still not getting right about this primary, secondary? So when we put them in this issue, we tried to be polite and call it proven hydronic concept, where we would take the drawing and we put a big X through it because that's not the way to do it. And then right next to it, we'd say, okay, what would I have to do to this drawing to clean this up? Because the installer went out there and he said, well, I get it, closely spaced tees. I got a tee there. I've got less than 12 inches, let's call it, between. I got a tee there. Don't I have closely spaced tees? Don't I have a circulator size for my load? How come this isn't primary, secondary? Isn't this going to work properly? Well, no. In fact, I had a call the other day, a boiler that was going into lockout because it was this exact piping drawing and it just wasn't getting enough flow through the boiler in this example here. So the only way you have primary, secondary, if the two tees are not only next to one another, but you're using them both as a supply and a return in the same cluster, let's call it, closely spaced tees. They can't be spread across different areas. So this kind of got close to that parallel that I showed earlier. If there was a crossover between those, this could have worked because that would have established my reference point for the temperature there, but this isn't going to work properly. This is going to be a problem, and you could again define based on what the distance is between those and what the flow restriction or the pressure drop is. You could define exactly what's going to go wrong with the system in numbers, but it's not going to work properly. Just trust me on that one. So got a loop, got my expansion tank in the right place. And notice in these drawings here, I'm showing these as just typical cast iron boilers. I don't know if you could notice the difference in the icons that we use when we're showing that's kind of indicating a high pressure drop boiler. Call it whatever brand you want, a Geonomy or Cermita type of heat exchanger. When we go to this other type of icon, that's intended to show maybe an oil-fired boiler there by the looks of the burner that's in it. So the other thing I wanted to point out of this, again, we're going to get to this more in the point of no pressure change, but if this is a low pressure drop boiler or sectional boiler, very little pressure drop, almost zero pressure drop in them, notice that I've got my expansion tank on the return. You say, wait, aren't you pumping at the expansion tank with all these pumps as they come in here? Again, since I've got a wide open vessel and I've got generously sized piping, I'm establishing the point of no pressure change to each one of these circulators through this piping, through the low pressure drop boiler, through the piping here. I'm pumping away here, I'm pumping away here through this connection into the boiler. So I know I'm going to get a call and say, well, shouldn't the expansion tank be up on the air separator? Well, no, I wouldn't necessarily have to be up there if you got a low pressure drop boiler. Could be up there, but we're trying to get you think a little differently on where that connection is and why it needs to be in different locations. So yeah, a similar mistake here. Closely spaced tees were put in properly. Now he's got them all clustered in the right piping. That's better. But you see the mistake here is you got to come off the first one. The pump always has to pump away from where the hottest water is coming in here, and it's got to come back into the one right next to it. It can't come back even though they look close, and maybe they are close. Maybe you've only got a couple, 12, 18 inches between them. You kind of do have them closely spaced, but they got to be in the next one right next to it. They can't be scattered somewhere else on the loop. Out of one branch into the branch right next to it, out of this branch here into the branch right next to it, the next pump would go down here, out of that one and back into it here. So this pump always needs to be on the first tee, the first branch going out here. I'll show you, in fact, maybe it's the next drawing. Yeah, so here's what, again, this is pretty close. This is really close. You got the tees right. You got your primary loop going around here. You got the piping size right, maybe according to the size of the pipe in the drawing. But you're saying, well, I'm flowing out, I'm going out through this set of tees and I'm coming back in this one. The circulator needs to be on this set of this first branch of the tee here so it can establish, in this case, that's how it's going to establish its point of no pressure change. What I've got going on in this drawing, it probably would flow properly, but I'm pumping at my expansion tank, because remember, my expansion tank is on the loop here. So now I'm banging at my expansion tank, and now I'm going to start to have pressure differential issues with this one. And what would happen in this, if I had a building where I had an air vent up here, I could actually pull a subatmospheric, I could pull a negative condition up here, and I could actually suck air into a flow type of air vent on the top of this, because this pump's going to kick on. It's going to establish this pressure differential from the suction side, could pull subatmospheric, and I can get air going into an air vent. And now you've got a problem. Not only do you have a callback because you don't have the piping right, but you got a callback because they keep getting air in their system. You go back and you purge this out, and you might get it working when you're there, but they call a couple days later and say, gosh, I got all this banging and rattling going on in my pipes again. You got to come back over and sort it out. And you keep going back and you purging, not understanding that you've got air being pulled into an air vent somewhere on that system, because you pull this down below subatmospheric. And know that I could pull a negative pressure in the system. I could pull a subatmospheric. I could have zero gauge pressure up here, number one, and I'll still have flow going around that. Just because I've got 0 PSI up there, as long as I've got water up to that point with my fill pressure, I can still have flow. And I could actually pull a subatmospheric condition in this, and I could still have a flow going through that. And one way you would know that, if you've ever seen any of those outdoor wood boilers, those are non-pressurized open to atmospheric systems, and they put piping up above the level of that, and the water still goes up there and it comes back down and it stays up there unless you open that up there and break the siphon, and the water stays up there. But basically what happens is when that circulator pump shuts off on a outdoor wood boiler that's not pressurized, and let's say I've got 15 feet of elevation before I get up to my baseboard on the second level, when that pump shuts off, take that 15 feet of elevation above the level of the water in that boiler times 0.433, there's your problem, Vern. You got a negative pressure up on that when the circulator is off. When the circulator's on, fine, you got a high head circulator pushing the flow up there. It's going to move around there, you're going to get heat. But when that shuts off, you pull a sub-negative. And what can happen in a condition like that, what we know about water is we can boil water at lower temperatures below 212 degrees if we pull a negative condition on it. If we go up in the mountains at 9,000 feet, we're going to boil water up there at, I don't know, 197 degrees, whatever it might be. The same thing can happen inside a piping circuit if I pull a subatmospheric condition. So what can happen is I can actually flash the steam up at the top of that loop because I pulled a negative, whatever that number comes out to, 3.6 negative PSI on that, and now I can actually boil water at 195 degrees, and now I've got I got steam hammer going on up inside my baseboard on the upper level of it because I've gotten in that subatmospheric condition. And again, we'll talk about that more on the point of no pressure change because it really comes into establishing that I've always got positive pressure at every point in my system.
Bob, can I interrupt you for another
Yeah, I need a drink.
question?
I'm
The
talking too
questions
much.
are just like flying. So thank you, audience. We're trying to get to them. But one of the questions we have is, could you pipe the primary secondary design with crossover piping where the crossover piping was piped in reverse return method and then eliminate the pressure differential controls?
You know, I'd have to see that on paper. I think if I'm following what he's saying, I think that's pretty close to where we had that one with the balancing valve, just changing the way that we do a reverse return on the secondary loop, let's call it, so that we eliminate that pressure drop going out. Basically, becomes a self-balancing on the secondary loop, so we don't have to put those balancing valves. I think that's the question. But if you'd send me a drawing on that, I want to make sure I've got it clear in my head before I give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. And if I don't know, I know people that will know. So I want to sort that out so we're both clear on what the correct answer is and what you're asking on that. So yeah, I'm kind of a visual guy for stuff like that sometimes. I need even a sketch sometimes will help me clear that up. So,
Thank you, Bob.
do you have another one? You want to do a couple more while we're
Oh,
here?
well, if you, yeah, I'm sure. As per John Siegenthaler, the reverse return would be a self-balancing only if all the loads are the same. So,
Okay.
thank you, John, for weighing in on
Thanks
that.
for being my wingman, my backup there. So. The other thing too that I don't know if there's a good place to put it on there, but I'm going to talk about the 20-degree delta T. And where did that come from is why, and you know what? I think somebody just pulled that out of their butt somewhere back in time. I can find no basis on why we design around a 20-degree delta T and why we have to run at a 20-degree delta T. And we're going to talk about that maybe in the next one we talk about heat transfer. So that was a question. And I challenge you to go and sit in front of a boiler for an hour and have it run at exactly a 20-degree delta T. It does move around, and it should move around, and it can move around. And I have no idea why the 20-degree, we know in Europe a lot of the panel radiator systems are designed around a 30, 35, sometimes even a 40-degree delta T if they've got enough temperature in the panel radiator size generously enough to work at that kind of a delta T. There's no reason that they couldn't go to 30 or 35. And we also know, everybody that's done radiant floor heat knows that we can design those down to a 15, sometimes an even 10-degree delta T. If we want to make sure that the temperature across that slab stays nice and even, we want to run a tighter delta T than 20. So to me, that 20 is just again, somebody just pulled that out of thin air in my opinion. So let me see if I got any of those pre-submitted questions. Yeah, I think we got to most of those. All right, so here's a couple things I want to talk about this. Anytime that you take this closely set T's, and we'll talk about this when we get to the demo, and if you go vertically off it, hot water likes to go up and cold water likes to come down because just like a hot air balloon, the reason it goes up in the air is somebody's got a propane burner under there and they're putting hot air in there and it goes up, and guess what they do when they want to come down? They stop putting hot air into it, and as that temperature in the balloon comes down, it comes down. And that's the same thing that'll happen here. If you don't have a way of stopping flow going up to this, what's going to happen is you're going to get a bit of hot water migrating up this and cold water coming down, and you're going to have what we call a ghost flow condition. Well, how much? Is it going to be a big issue? Well, maybe, maybe not. It really depends on, number one, the size of this loop. What we know about, well, go back to the old gravity circulation buildings before they even used circulator pumps. And the problem they had with those is the floors at the top of the building would get more flow going up to them than the ones at the bottom, and they would actually have to go and choke that off so that they would get heat back down to the lower ones, because the hot water wants to shoot up to the highest point in the building as quickly as possible. That's using that temperature imbalance to drive. That is what happens, and that's what we did until we came out with circulators, because there was some limitation of what you could do with that gravity flow. So In this drawing here, I'd want to put a check valve. In fact, I would encourage you to put a check valve on both sides. I've seen these where you put a check valve on one side, and what can happen, believe it or not, and I found a really nice diagram of this today on one of the sites when I was searching out. It shows how flow can go two directions in a pipe just based on gravity. So what'll happen is, let's say I choke off by putting the check valve over here on this here pump on this last drawing, and I don't have any check protection on this, you can actually have hot water go up the center of that, go through whatever the heat emitter is up there, and come back down the same pipe. And it's going to be a slow heat migration, and it might be something that takes days or weeks to cause a problem. But the call is going to be, I've got my thermostat upstairs shut all the way off, and I'm still getting heat coming out of my floor, my baseboard, my radiator, whatever it might be. It might be a small amount of heat, but it's going to be enough over a period of time that it can cause the that circuit to overheat. So in a perfect world, I'd like to see a check valve put a certain distance away from the discharge of the circulator so it's not in a turbulent condition. This is kind of a compromise, in my opinion. It's better than nothing at all, but that's not a great place to have a check valve, because it is in that, you know, as the water's coming out of the volute of that pump, you're going to have a little turbulent condition that can sometimes cause a check valve to rattle. I will say the spring check valves pretty much take care of that little rattling that we would have if you had a check valve in there that was a brass to brass seat and didn't have a spring tension behind it. But in a perfect world, if we were doing everything right, we'd have a check valve, again, pipe diameters away from that, 8 pipe diameters away from the discharge side of that. So yeah, we talked about the thermal siphoning there. We talked about
Bob, just a question there, but instead of a check valve, what about a drop loop piping?
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds
I
like an
think I put that.
explanation.
I don't know if I put that in my next drawing or not. We talked about that too, and people said, well, what if I came here and dropped down and came back up? And I'm going to steer you to an article that Siggy wrote about this, and I think we all got thrown for a little bit of a loop. You can still get some thermal migration through that loop. I don't know if we can open Siggy's mic there if you would want to talk about that. Let me see, first of all, if I put that in there. I wanted to put some of these. No, I didn't put it in there. Yeah, we found that thermal siphon, stopping that thermal siphon with what we call a thermal trap, like a P-trap coming down where we drop off the bottom and then go back up, didn't always work the way we thought it. And so we made them longer, we made them deeper, and we still had some problems with the getting some ghost flow through those thermal traps. So I would say the check valve, number one, you can get them in the circulator pumps. Most of them ship with them, so why not use that and add the second one on the return side, and you'd have a 100% shut off on both of those. Would be my my suggestion, as opposed to the thermal trap.
I can check if John is available if he needs to add to that. Mr. Siegenthaler,
Yeah,
would you
hi.
like to chime in on that?
Hey,
Hi.
great job, Hot Rod. That's a good question. And I tried using a underslung thermal trap on both the supply and the return side, thinking that if it, you know, the old Bell and Gossett manual showed an underslung return on the return side. So I said, well, if it works on a return, why won't it work on supply? Tried it, doesn't work. The problem, you're still going to get thermal siphoning, and it would probably take 10 minutes to explain exactly why, but I would tell you to avoid it. You could use the underslung trap on the return side, but as Hot Rod says, stick with the check valve on the supply side.
And I think you wrote a whole article for that in PM Engineering or one of the magazines, and that's where I learned about it. In fact, we talked about this earlier in the week, but it is hard to explain without some pictures and some graphics, and sorry I didn't put those in there, but don't do it, I guess, would be the bottom line. But I'll steer you to that. I can link you to the article that Siggy wrote about just that exact thing about those thermal drops. It was years ago, but it's still a valid point.
Thank you,
What I
John, very
wanted to,
much.
I guess we got to get to a video here. I better keep moving. I wanted to show a couple things here about primary, secondary. So here's where it really starts to get complicated. I tried to, and thanks Siggy for these drawings too, by the way, showing that this is both the advantages and the good things about primary, secondary, and some of the bad things about it. Is number one, it allows you to mix and match a lot of different circulators. I never counted them go through here. There's probably a dozen different circulators. Every one of these circulators could be a different size. You know, I could have 2 different size boilers. I could have a high pressure drop boiler with a regular boiler in here, each with its own circulator. As long as I've got these closely spaced tees applied properly, sized properly, the piping's properly sized, that all these are going to get along with one another just fine. I've got my big series primary loop going through here. My conveyor belt's going around here. I've got boilers that can modulate in. I've got indirect tank that I'm going to take right off as my first load coming off that. Both the boilers could fire to cover that loop. I've got some low temperature loops down here. I've even put a plate heat exchanger in here that I could separate a glycol loop and maybe some snow melting circuits out here. So this becomes a whole nother hydronic setup here. It's got to have an expansion tank, got to have air elimination because it's not the same fluid once we separate it with that heat exchanger there. So this is really where primary secondary shines. I want to take you a step beyond this on our next or one of our next get-togethers here. But you know, the more complicated the piping, the more boilers, the more pumps, the more things you've got going on, adds a lot more value to this primary secondary and the closely spaced tees, different temperatures blended down in some of these areas here. So yeah, I mean, we could spend the day just going through all the different components in here and what they mean and why they work, and maybe we'll do that someday. Is just take a single drawing and explain, okay, why do you have a pressure differential valve here? You know, how are you mixing this temperature and that? That might be a good one. Just do a Q&A and open it up to a complicated system. And there's one, I think Siggy actually designed this for a customer in Wisconsin years ago that, again, you can see how complicated that gets. A lot more mixed down temperatures there with the circulators here. One of the questions that came in was about injection mixing as opposed to mixing valve. You know, I don't know, the injection mixing is kind of fallen out of favor now. You know, where we used to put a pump and vary the speed to change the temperature going out to that. It cost us a pump, cost us a control. I see more people going to either thermostatic mixing valve. Taco's got some nice products for doing temperature mixing with that 3-port ball valve that you can actually put an outdoor reset control on it. So it, you know, it takes a pump out of the job. It simplifies some of your piping, some of your pressure drop issues go away, and some of the math and the calculations involved in sizing those injection loops and pumps and getting them set up right goes away. So unless there's a question, I'm going to try and do my might need my my assistant here to get me back to my I got a little QuickTime player that we're going to show a video, and then Mary's going to help me through this, and then we'll come back and do some more questions. So I'll close out on this and my show and find my QuickTime player.
You want to move it to the other screen?
You see that okay, Mary or Kevin?
Yep, it looks great.
Yep.
Like a large building where you could just run a single loop around the building. Bob, Hot Rod Rohr, ShopTalk. Today we're going to talk about primary secondary pipe. And this was a concept that Bell and Gossett developed years ago. And basically what it was intended to fix some problems they were having with old diverter T systems where they weren't getting enough flow out to the branches. And an engineer came in and said, you know what, let's just put a circulator on some of those branches. And so the concept of primary secondary is really developed to handle like a large building where you can run a single loop around the building, a single pipe around the building like a conveyor belt. I'm going to show you that here in a second. And then anywhere that you want to tie into that loop to take a heat circuit off, you would put a pair of closely spaced tees with a close nipple between them like this. And now this would be a primary loop, the conveyor belt that's circulating around. And then I would put a circulator on this one loop here, and I could just pull off the amount of flow I needed for that individual loop, and I could do that all through the building. So it really kind of freed up the piping. So I want to show you some of the things that I've learned about it, good news and bad news, that we're going to show you here in this little clear demo I have here. So let's zoom in on that, and I'll show you how this whole thing works. All right, so here's the primary secondary loop. And so what I'm going to call the primary loop is this big outer loop that comes down, goes around here, this 3/4 tube here, comes back up, goes through my air dirt separator, my circulator pump. Got a little flow setter so I can set my flow rate and see what it is, adjust that as we go. So I'm going to run that loop, and notice I've got some blue fluid in that. And when I run this, when I turn the pump on, that whole loop is going to stay blue, and nothing's going to happen out here in the secondary. Notice I put some red food coloring in this loop here. It's starting to dilute here as we talk. And then I'm going to shut the main loop off, the primary loop, and I'm going to run this loop, the secondary, and you'll see the red will go through here, and it won't cause any flow to go around the big primary loop. So that's how we know that they're hydraulically separated from one another. And then I'm going to run them at different flow rates, 4 gallons a minute, 2 gallons a minute. At some point, of course, the colors are going to blend, but that just will show you the disconnect here between the primary loop and the secondary loop, all because of this closely spaced T setup that I have built over here. So let's get this thing fired up and see what happens. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the outer primary loop, and I've got some blue color in there. So let's get this started. There'll be a little air in there because I just filled it up. And you can see it's going straight through there, and there's no flow moving out to the secondary loop here. You can see the little bubbles I've got in there because I just filled it. Now I'm going to shut that off. That's going to run. I could run 5 gallons a minute, 2 gallons a minute through that, and it doesn't interfere. This is what we call the secondary loop on this closely spaced T. This is why that happens. So over here, like I say, I put some red in over here. I'm going to shut that off, and I'm going to run this one without the primary, and you'll see this red is just going to go around here, and it won't cause any flow in the primary loop. That's how we know that they're hydraulically separated from one another. So let me turn that one off. There might be a little bit of air in that other one here, so it might take a minute to get going. There we go. You can see the flow, see the color change there? So I'm just coming out of that closely spaced T and back into that closely spaced T. All right, so I've been running this for a while, and you can see the two colors have blended, the red and the blue that was in there, we turned into the purple. But what I want you to do is zoom in on this closely spaced T's, and you'll actually see when I start this up, I pump some air in there, you'll see a 2 different directional flow here. So flow is going to come like this through here, while flow is going through there this way. And the rate of those two would be dependent on how fast I'm running the pumps. If I'm putting 4 gallons a minute through here and 2 gallons per minute there, it would change the blending going on there. Let me see if we can just show this here. A little bit of air in there, maybe it'll show. Air coming down, so I've got flow going through. You can see those bubbles, but I've also flow is going backwards. See how this is coming here? So there's actually flow going along the side of this, going this direction, while the flow goes straight through the primary loop there, and that's how you get the blending of the 2 different colors inside the primary second. And I could change the flow rates, and it would change how much is going this way as opposed to going straight through. All right, so let's wrap it up on the primary secondary. So the whole key is these closely spaced T's. If you don't have closely spaced T's, you don't have primary secondary. They have to be right next to one another. The pump comes out of the supply side, returns on the other side. One of the things that can go a little south on this primary secondaries, if you had closely spaced T's, let's say up here on a horizontal line, maybe they're put in there right there. What'll happen is when the primary circulator is running, you'll get some flow going up and coming back down because the hot water goes up and the cold water comes down. So if you are going to take off a horizontal line, go straight up vertically, you got to put a check valve on your circulator, and you got to have a check valve on this side so you don't get reverse flow or you don't get ghost flow going through there. That was one of the problems we learned. That people say, you know, my upstairs is overheating, the thermostat's off, what's going on? We were getting ghost flow through that. We had to go back and put a couple check valves in there. So that's one of the things to beware of when you start piping these together. Thanks for watching. Okay, how do I get that off? All right.
There you go.
All right, that's what we have for the little video there. Let me swap my displays here. Yeah, we'll take any questions on any of the slides or any of the topics or anything else that's on your mind. Let me see. I'm going to go through my pre-submitted ones here. I'll get my webcam back on.
And Bob, while you're doing that, Mr. Lou Garavito has had his hand up forever.
Oh,
I'm going to unmute you, Lou, and we'll see if you got a question there.
No, I apologize. I tried to answer a question before and I forgot to lower my hand. Sorry about that.
No, no worries. Thank you.
glad to hear your voice. Yeah, let me look over my pre-submitted questions here. Best place to purge a circuit. I think I talked about that and why I don't like to have the, you know, a valve in between them. I'd like to have whatever brand you want to use, a competitor, but Webstone makes a nice valve for purging here, you know, where you can shut it off and purge. In fact, some of their new valves you can purge from 2 different directions, just the way you turn the handle. So if you want to purge from the return side, purge from the supply side, it's a nice way to do it. And then the other thing about purging, if you try and purge a lot at once, like if you only had one purge valve back here and you're trying to purge all the system through one purge valve, that's a pretty tough go unless you've got a monster amount of GPM going in there and obviously a monster purge valve that you can get that amount of flow out. So breaking it into little subsystems like you see here, purges on these, purges on this one here. I would purge every, you know, single loop in there independently instead of trying to do it with one valve. You can do it with one valve if you got a series like baseboard loop and a single boiler, a single zone. You might have just one valve back at the old Dan Holohan, you know, package where you put the purge and the expansion tank and the air separator with a ball valve there, and you had a great way to purge it quickly and get it going. So, what else? Any other questions, Kevin or Mary? Or
Yes. on the picture with the heat exchanger, are you
Yeah.
pumping into the expansion tank?
On this one right here, I guess this is the one that's got a little heat exchanger here. So now keep in mind that this is a separate circuit from the other one here. So this expansion tank, this loop right here is, there's the expansion tank, there's the point of no pressure change. So just this little, I guess a little snow melt circuit going on out here is just going through there. So this is pumping away from the point of no pressure change. Keep in mind, because of this flat plate heat exchanger, it separates the two fluids. I've got a completely different fluid up here than I do in here. So just think of splitting this right down the middle and this being a, a completely different hydronic circuit separated, obviously with glycol for the snow melt, separated by that plate heat exchanger. And that's why in this circuit, you've got to have an expansion tank. You also have to have a pressure relief valve in there. You've got to have an air separator in there because you've got to get the air out of this circuit separate from the boiler looping up here. So I think that's the question. Maybe the other drawing was a little clearer on that.
Another question for you, Bob.
Yeah, right
How
here.
could we figure out our boiler supply temperature based upon our zones or loads on a ModCon boiler?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if you're talking about going into primary, secondary here, you're going to have to know that mixed temperature formula that I showed you a little bit earlier. If I know how many gallons per minute is going out of this boiler and what temperature it's going out, and I know how many gallons per minute is going through the loop that I'm injecting into it, I can calculate that temperature. And what I'd want to do, ideally with a condensing type boiler, is I'd want to bring the lowest possible temperature back to that condensing boiler so I could keep it in the condensing range and keep my efficiency up. Now, at some point, the load's a load. You got to get the temperature that the load requires to cover the load. And on a design day, you might get that boiler where it's running up out of a condensing mode to be able to cover that load. But we'd certainly want to maximize that return temperature or minimize that return temperature to keep that condensing boiler. But yeah, you just have to run the mixed. I'll probably send you the. I think Hydronics 15, we have that mixed temperature formula. You can find that online in different places that shows you, okay, I need the two flow rates, I need the temperature on my secondary, the temperature going here. You can leave one number out of that. Obviously, that's the one that you're going to solve for. So as long as I know flow rates and some temperature, I can solve for the unknown, whatever temperature you want to know, either the return coming back to the boiler with the mixed temperature going out to the zone or to the circuit is, or to the primary loop in this case.
Okay, Bob, another question. Are you going to talk about low loss headers or buffer tanks for hydraulic separation?
Yeah, we are. In fact, I was going to try and cram it in here, and I said, I don't think I can get all that into an hour. So I want to go, I want to talk about hydraulic separators and buffer tanks. I'll probably do a buffer tank as a separate one, but I will do a hydraulic separator, low loss header. You can call them different things, but and I'll show how a buffer tank can be both a buffer tank and a low loss header, a primary, secondary, or a hydraulic separator. I guess it's probably the best. It's just a supersized hydraulic separator, and we'll do that in another session. And I'll show you some really neat tricks about ways to pipe that Siggy taught me and that we've been playing around with for years now. A 4-pipe buffer, a 2-pipe buffer, a 3-pipe buffer. Why would I do one or the other? What advantages and disadvantages? In fact, I've got a buffer tank right here in my shop that will actually do a little demo of how you can turn just a basic electric water heater into a pretty nice buffer tank if you just need a little 6 or 10 gallon buffer tank. I'll go through that. So I really consider primary, secondary kind of, time to move on. I don't want to call it horse and buggy. I got in trouble for calling an air purger horse and buggy on my last or 2 seminars ago, but I will call it kind of a, there's better ways to do it that we can accomplish. I mean, I could clean up this drawing with a hydraulic separator and take a lot of this paraphernalia, I'll call it, a lot of these components out of here, because I could build into one device, my air separation, my dirt separation, my magnetic separation, my primary, secondary, low loss header function. I could put it into a nice insulated box right now and solve problems, probably make money doing it. It'd take a lot of labor out of the job if I could just make 4 connections to a separator, a buffer tank, and fire it up and walk away from it and accomplish a little buffering in the process of doing that. If it's a buffer or even a separator adds a couple gallons of capacity to a boiler that might only hold 1 or 2 gallons. I put a hydro separator in that holds 2. Now I got a 4-gallon boiler instead of a 2-gallon boiler. So just that in itself will give you a little bit of a buffer capacity by putting the hydraulic separator in. So yeah, we'll get to that. Small step for small feet here for me. All right, what else, Mary?
Oh gosh, there's a let's see, let's talk about this one. Any straight pipe distance needs off the bowls of the closely spaced tees. Does that make sense?
Maybe I can go back up to that drawing quickly. I think this is what, no, I went too far. What was the question again? The distance, or read it to me
Any,
again? I was gonna,
yes, any straight pipe distance
yep.
needed off the bowls of the closely spaced tees.
On this distance here, I guess is what we're calling the D dimension there. Yeah, I mean, we're showing here 4D. I mean, that's again, best practices. I've seen them, you know, where the elbow's right here. I've seen another set of tees banged right up against us with only an inch or two between there. But I would like to see, like we show here, the 4 times the pipe diameter. So if that's a 1-inch pipe, I'd like to see 4 inches in there. What happens when you start doing these big series primary loops in a mechanical room, you start running out of real estate if you start having to spread all these out with this kind of dimension. And that's where I think people say, well, you know, they didn't give me enough wall space and give me enough room to do that. So either you got to drop down and take some of your tees up here, take them off on the bottom. So sometimes, you know, these dimensions will get squished a little just because it doesn't fit. You know, and that's another reason if we get into a hydraulic separator, all this real estate that I need to put all these tees with the proper spacing between them kind of goes away. That problem kind of gets just disappears by using a separator instead of closely spaced tees.
Hey Bob, this is Kevin. We had a kind of similar question from Jordan. He's referring to pumps. Can you put elbows or valves, you know, right on the inlet or the outlet of a circulator? Is that okay to do that?
No, you want to have a little distance, certainly on the suction side. I don't want any flow restricting device. I don't want a Y strainer banged up against the suction of it, knowing that that's going to plug. I don't like an elbow or any kind of change of direction right to it. I would use probably this same thing. Maybe C could type in if he's got an idea, but I would think at least 4 pipe diameters on the inlet side of a circulator of straight pipe without any valves, without any L's or with anything. And we actually in Hydronic 16, we covered that quite a bit. We've got a good graphic in there, kind of, again, X's through things that you don't want to do with a circulator on the inlet side, and probably a little bit on the discharge side, depending on what's downstream of this. Now, if I had an elbow right here and I had some distance before I got to my load, whatever, you know, kind of tumbling that you get from the action going through that L is probably going to straighten out before it gets in your load and not going to cause a problem. But yeah, those are just, again, best practices. I don't know that there's any official rule that if you don't have a certain amount that, you know, you're going to lose your license or it's not going to work. Again, I've seen these things crammed in where there's tees against tees and pumps against pumps and mixing valves against the pump like that. You know, when you have to build it into a box or into a you know, a 4x4 square feet of plywood, some of these best practices kind of get thrown out the window.
Bob, I'm
Fairly
going to
forgiving
ask you.
hydronics, I will say that. You can make quite a few piping mistakes and they still work. I mean, I've seen boilers run with the pumps not even running on them anymore, cast iron boilers where there's no, you know, pump flow going through it and the boiler's still running. It's not banging off or not blowing off its relief valve. But you know, we want to optimize all the systems. You know, we want to give the customer the best efficiency. We want to give them the quietest system. We want to give them the most bang for their bucks, the least amount of power consumption, the least amount of gas consumption. So we want to, you know, use all these little formulas and all these little tricks that we're teaching you to really maximize the you know, the product that you're selling to your customer and kind of distance yourself from the competitors if you've got a better way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. And Bob, Lou did have a question. If you've got hard water in the building and scale builds up on the boiler heat exchanger, what
Yeah.
would be a good indicator that this is a problem causer?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing I would do with any boiler that I fill up is test the water before you put it in there. And you can go on Amazon and buy a hardness test kit for, I think I bought one for $20 or something, like free shipping on it with the Amazon Smile or Amazon Prime, whatever we had. But I would test every water that on every job that you go to, because it's a quick and easy thing to do. And if it's over 10 grains hardness, you really should do something with that water before you put it in there, especially with these high efficiency boilers. In fact, here's a cutaway of a little Gianomi heat exchanger that came out of, I don't know, Munchkin, I don't remember where it came out of, but it doesn't take much scale buildup on the inside of that tubing before you're going to have number one, you're going to start overheating that boiler, and usually the first indication is they'll start percolating. It's kind of the same sound that your tea kettle makes when it starts to fill up with scale on the bottom, and when the burner comes on, you hear that popping, pang, popping. That's usually the first indication that you got some scale buildup on. A lot of scale, you're not going to get enough flow through that. You might have a high delta T going through that boiler. You might have a high temperature lockout because you're not scrubbing the heat off of that metal, off of that heat exchanger, and getting it into the water, because you've just basically put some insulation on the inside of that. And I'll tell you, 10 grains or harder water, you've got a scale buildup the very first day you put it in there, and it doesn't go away unless somebody comes back and puts a cleaner in there and scrubs it off there, because that high temperature metal, it's just like a magnet. It just pulls that line scale right against that hot metal surface, and now you've got you dropped your efficiency. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. We're going to do a water specific webinar too, just talk about, okay, what do I need to do to my water if it is bad? How do I fix it? What are my options? Can I use chemicals? When do I have to bring water into the job site? We'll talk about all those things in another shop talk session. I think is probably the best way. But yeah, I mean, check your water. I can't, everything that's in that system, your pumps, your boilers, your zone valves, your mixing valves, your balancing valves, all of them are really sensitive to hard water. Some of them are going to reward you quicker than others. In fact, I had a little balancing valve here that's got just a tiny little window in it. That scale starts coming off that surface and gets into that port on that pressure independent balancing valve. Now you got a balancing valve that's not even doing what it can do. So yeah, you gotta, more so than ever with high efficiency boilers, with high efficiency circulators, we got to keep the junk out of our systems.
So Bob, should that makeup water be soft?
That's a controversial issue right now. I've got a friend that's a contractor over in the UK, and he used the softened water on every one of his boilers, and he explains it. He said it's the lesser of two evils. He said, we've got 20, 30 grain water in some places over there on the island. He said, I don't want to put that in the boiler. He said, I'd rather pay a little bit of penalty on my, what happens when you put water in with that's been softened, the conductivity of that water is up pretty high because of the salt that you go in there doesn't all backwash out. And so now you've got potential for electrolysis. Whenever you've got dissimilar metals, whether you got a stainless steel boiler, you got a steel nipple, you got copper, you got brass, you got aluminum in some of your boilers, whenever you have dissimilar metals and you've got a electrolyte, and what I mean by electrolyte is fluid with a high conductivity, now you've got the potential for those two metals to work against one another. And that's when you see like where somebody screwed a nipple into the aluminum boiler and all of a sudden the threads around that nipple are starting to go away. That's from electrolysis, and electrolysis is because you've got high conductivity water, and softened water leads to high conductivity. But now again, is who's the guy, Mary from Vitech Heating over there, he says, at some point we got to do the better of the two, the lesser of the two evils. And he said, I'll put softened water in a boiler before I'll put 20, 30 grains of hardness. I would like them to take it a step further and use deionized water, where we rip everything out of the water, get the hardness out of the water, get all the scaling minerals out of, get all the the positive and negative ions out. And again, we'll talk about that in a water quality issue. But just look at your water and see how bad it is. It's I've been in places up in Canada where it's 30 grains hard. I'm surprised the water even flows out of a faucet when it's got that much hardness to it. But yeah, it's not a good thing to have bad water in good systems.
Just one more question here, Bob, and a little unrelated, but since we're talking about this water and fluid, do you need to flush, do you need to flush a fire tube boiler yearly, or just boilers with plate heat exchangers?
I don't like flushing boilers, because every time you flush boiler, you're putting new water in, you're putting fresh water in, which is going to have some minerals in it, but you're also putting oxygen in that system again, because within the air that's in that water that's in the system when you put it in there is a percentage of oxygen, which now you got to make sure that we've got that absorbed out of the system. So, I mean, I would only flush a boiler if you're having a problem with it. If you're going to put a cleaner in that boiler and flush it out, I mean, if that boiler is not taking on fresh water, there's really no reason it should have to be flushed if it was, properly started in the beginning. We'll talk about flushing it out, put a cleaner in there, put good water in, and seal it up and walk away from that boiler. And you shouldn't have fluid quality issues if you started out on the right foot with low TDS water that isn't, the pH is balanced properly. And yeah, I mean, if Wheels or somebody on the session wants to talk more about fire tube boilers and flushing them, again, if there isn't a problem in there, let the sleeping dog lie. If you're flushing a boiler because it's noisy and you got scale buildup in there, the scale's coming from somewhere. It probably didn't leave the factory up there in Canada with scale in it. If it's a NTI boiler, whatever brand you're using, they don't come with scale in them. All right. Any more? What are we at? 8:14 here. I mean, I'll stay on if there's another question, or we can call it a day. It looks like we still got quite a few people on there, but yeah, I mean, any question that you want to throw at us, I'll answer, whether it's specific to primary, secondary, whatever else you might have on your mind. We're all here. What else are we going to do? Eat dinner. My wife's laughing about that one. What do you say? The two
I'm
lost
still
souls.
laughing about your small feet and little steps. Your
Ah.
big feet.
Well, anything else, Mary or Kevin, or?
Well, there's a lot of questions here, Bob. I don't know where to start. We will let everybody know that we can follow up with these. A lot of these questions, though, go back to the the hydronics that Bob talked about at the very beginning. A lot of these questions are answered in there. We can certainly help you. Just get in contact with us later. The tech support line, give us a call. We'll find the answer for you and follow up individually. We have lots and lots of questions here.
Yeah, I mean, give me one or two more. I know all you guys want to get to bed too or something, but I'll answer them, via email, the ones that we can't get to here, or call, if you have the phone number there, I'll call people. You can call me and or email me, however you want to talk these days. I got plenty of time to chat with whoever's got a question or got something they want to just talk about. I'm glad to do that. But yeah, pick one or two more and we'll do that, and then we'll.
Here's one that's come in from a couple of different people. They're talking about the distances between the closely spaced tees, like from one zone to the other. Is the 4-pipe diameter, does that still come into play between the zones of each of the closely spaced tees?
Yeah, and when I say close here, I mean, I always put a close nipple, whether you're using threaded tees. If you're using threaded tees, get a close nipple or the next size up from a close nipple, so you got a little space in there. Or if I'm using copper, I'll just cut a close nipple, just leave enough room so you can get a good solder joint in there. And years ago, when I did these, I would just use my T-drill, and I'd bump my T-drill right against the bracket that goes on the T-drill that you have to put on the pipe. Then it comes against the one that you just pulled out, so you can't get them like a half an inch apart, but you could get them within 2 inches of one another if you T-drilled them. So again, as close as you can. Now, some of the pre-made headers that the boiler manufacturers are sending out, they might have 4 or 6 inches. I don't like the ones that have them like 12 inches apart. I like the ones where they kind of bring them together like that, so they do have that 4 inches of that close spacing between the tees on those pre-made primary, secondary headers that some of the boiler manufacturers send out as an option. But then the distance between them, again, these are all perfect scenarios that I would have 4 pipe diameters before I put my next set of tees on this run here.
Yeah, I think that's what they're asking, is from one pair of closely spaced, on downstream to the next zone.
Yeah, I would use the same 4D number here, and make this a T instead of an elbow, and put your next set of closely spaced tees there.
Yeah, and that's a minimum, so they could be much further away.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, there's no harm in going further. Like I said, as long as you have the real estate available in your room to do that. All right. Got another favorite, or you want to?
How about the best place for a purge valve on a thermostatic mixing system, before or after the return inlet tee to the mix?
Yeah, I'd like to go through the mix valve first, and then as I'm coming back on return, if it's a primary, secondary, I put that valve right there. So let's say I came off of here and I had a mixing valve right here, so I'd have the valve here, my hot would go in here, my cold would come into the other side, my cold would return back into obviously the mixing valve into this. I put that valve right there because all the flow has to go back into this circuit at some point. And the other thing, if you're putting pumps in with circulators with check valves in them, obviously you got to flow through it that direction. So if you're pumping away from your mixing valve, which you should be, you got to purge in that direction anyway. So I always just put a valve with a good purge port right on the return side, and I don't know if it showed it in any of those that Siggy had down on that big drawing. I don't know if there's some. See if there's some on there.
But we do have a raised hand from Richard Furman. Richard, I'm going to unmute you. And if you'd still like to ask your question, you certainly may.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Um, I'm wondering, with closely placed tees, can you get enough of a pressure differential to not have to use the secondary pump?
um, did you hear that, Mary or Kevin? It kind of warbled out there halfway through. Something
Yeah,
about
he's asking if there's
try
enough
it
of a
again.
pressure drop between the tees, can you do away with a secondary
Oh,
pump?
you lose everybody?
You there, Bob?
Maybe
We may have
Kevin,
lost Bob.
Kevin, could you
Yeah,
answer that question?
I
Everybody there?
can.
Mary, Kevin?
I think we lost Bob, but I can answer that question. You still have to have a secondary pump because there's not enough of a pressure drop between those tees to get any flow to go into that secondary circuit. So you have to have something to pull that
Yeah, but
water
you're
out
kind
of
of
the,
up a little bit.
you have
Maybe
to have
go to,
something to draw that water out of the conveyor belt.
yeah, I mean, you got to have a pump on the secondary circuit. There's no way that you're going to get flow going out to this unless there is a circulator on that. Again, let's call that the secondary loop, because in this example, I've got my expansion tank. This is my primary loop. This is actually, if you look at this closely, this is your primary loop right here, since the expansion tank there. This is a secondary loop, and these could be third loops coming off of that, because look, we've got closely spaced tees here, we've got closely spaced tees here, and also here. So this gets to be, what do you call it, a tritary instead of just a primary secondary. That's why I put this in there, because it is a little bit more complex. But yeah, there always has to be a circulator there, and it has to be sized just for that load. It's not sized for the, let's call it 40 gallon a minute going through this loop. It's not sized for that. It's just sized for what exactly this this load out here is.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Looks like there's one more here, Bob. On this diagram, it looks like the pump between the heat exchanger and the snow melt loop seems to be pumping into the expansion tank. Did we talk about that? I think you did. You said that other circulator down there
Yeah.
on the snow melt. Yeah, that other circulator is the suction side of that is where that expansion tank is. So that's in that loop. That expansion tank is not on the discharge side of that pump pulling from the heat exchanger.
Yeah, maybe it's not real clear on their end, but yeah, this expansion tank is tied into that air purger right there, and there's the pump. I don't know if you can see the air on it, but it is pumping. I mean, I've got maybe, I don't know, a foot of pipe between where the point of no pressure changes on this on the air purger here in my pump. So that's pumping away, and then this circulator here is pumping away through this connection into the primary loop over there. There's my expansion tank, and let's again call that the primary loop where the boilers are. So this, through this piping right here, is where this pump is pumping away from this expansion tank, and this pump down here is pumping away from this expansion tank, and this one here, maybe this one, is this the one he's talking about here? That could be the one that we're talking about here. It looks like it's pumping at the expansion tank in this drawing right here.
Yeah, but you've got those closely spaced tees down there, so
yeah.
It's
so
not really pumping into that.
Yeah, now that's debatable, because you can see that in order for that to get that expansion tank there, yeah, I'm gonna have to call in a lifeline for that one, because this one does look like it is pumping into that point right there. Yeah, to be pulling through that, you'd have to go through the pressure drop of the heat exchanger, come around to that, and then they have to cross over through the common piping in the closely spaced tees here to get that reference back to this expansion tank. But yeah, you know what? I'm gonna find out more about that, because I think you're right there that one does look like it's pumping at this expansion tank, because that is all on the secondary side of that flat plate heat exchanger.
Another question is, if it worked out this way, is there any issue having my supply closely spaced T facing up and my return facing down? So could you?
No, you can. I've seen that.
Okay,
yeah.
So that's okay as long as they're right next to each other. One can be going up, one can be going down.
Yeah, and I've seen them going off at right angles to one another. One goes up and one goes out to the side for some reason. Usually when they put them on the side like this, you might see one go in one direction, maybe one out the back. That's fine as long as they're close together.
John had a couple comments on that circulator, that it could be moved to the outer side of the heat exchanger.
Yeah, I think that would probably been a better. We'll give you a pass. This was 2005 that this was drawing, so yeah, that was a good catch. Whoever caught that, that's good eye on that, because that does play into exactly what we're saying. I mean, I'm sure that works and it would work, but there could be a better place to establish that that pump's point of no pressure change. Thanks, Siggy, for chipping in on that.
Hey, Bob, this is Mark. I just had a quick point. There was an earlier comment about on this diagram, how could you get away with so many T's on a system? And but I think if you study what John did here, and you know, coming off of the primary there, your highest temperature is going to be your domestic hot water. So your highest temperature is going to be there. And you can see the next one's going to be your snow melt zone, where he's got a heat exchanger where you're going to have some loss there. So as the temperature, he's prioritizing your higher temperature secondaries, it looks like. So as your water gets cooler and cooler and cooler, then it goes to the radiant on your last zones before it heads back to the boilers.
Yeah, and now this here, these aren't closely spaced T's on this loop. Keep that. So this is my primary loop over here, and then you see, so I've got a supply coming off the upper one, and my returns going in this lower one here. So this is actually your parallel distribution out here. So it goes back to that very first drawing. Let's see, kind of where we had the jumpers across the. Yeah, these aren't closely spaced here. Maybe this drawing isn't big enough and when it shows up on your end, but these aren't taken off that loop as a primary, secondary, closely spaced T's like you have here.
Are closely spaced T's the same as diverter T's? This is from Richard Furman.
No, so diverter T's, I can go back to that quickly. It's kind of a clever thing. Whoever came up with the idea of a diverter T is, I don't know if Dan's on tonight, he could talk to us a little bit better, but the diverter T, basically, if you look in the end of it, it has a restriction. It has a little orifice built inside there, and you can't quite see it in the end of it. But this little ring right here, there's a small hole in that, and basically what it does, it creates just enough pressure resistance as the water's trying to go through there that some of the water says, you know what, we can't all fit through that small hole in that opening. I'm going to go up here. So that's all a diverter T is doing, is it's got a little bit of a restriction in that plate that's built inside the end of that's causing some of the flow to go up through your radiator, would be here, and then will come back into it. So yeah, and you got to be careful with these. Number one, they got to be in the right direction, and this red ring indicates that you've got that orifice built into that. I've seen people put a nickel in there and a 3/4 pipe, and you can drill a hole and make your own diverter T. There's probably a little bit of engineering or science in the size of that T for the branch on it. And again, talking to Dan earlier this week about primary, secondary, he said there was some blue ring ones years ago that had even a tighter hole in them. He said that was a problem with that apartment building. The blue ring diverter Ts were just too much pressure drop, that they weren't getting enough flow out to some of those distant branches.
Bob, Dan is on. Dan,
Oh.
if you would like to chime in, I'm going to unmute you. We would love to hear from you. If you are out there, you are live.
Hi, Dan.
Hello.
Maybe.
Hi, Dan.
He
Okay.
got muted on his end.
Yeah, perhaps. So, false alarm.
All right. Well, you're here in spirit, even if we can't hear your voice, Dan. Yeah, this was a great crowd. Thanks everybody for hanging in there and for tuning in today. And like I say, I'll get back to all the questions, and like I say, I can call on some lifelines if I need to on some of the more complicated. And thanks for being with us, and we'll see you on the next one. What do we have keyed up for the next one, Mary? About heat transfer, how heat transfer works, I think.
Next Monday, same time, same place.
Yeah, and then you know, send in any what you'd like to hear us cover, and we'll get it, and we'll tee it up for the next week, because we don't have the next 4 put together yet as far as the schedule or what order we're going to do them in. But yeah, we like doing this. So speaking for myself, I know Mary and Kevin are probably saying, okay, wrap it up here.
No, we're having a lot of fun. Be sure to check your pantries. We're just hearing on in the pantries, Salvation Army, Ronald McDonald houses, their pantries are getting low. So if you have some food to spare and you can drop that food off or a homeless shelter, wherever, we would just love it. Make sure you shoot a selfie. We would love to share that next week on episode 4. Okay.
And get the address of the person that won the trivia contest for the Pink Floyd.
Yep, we got that too.
Hey, it was Hug a Plumber weekend.
Oh, it is. Everybody do
So
that.
hug your plumber.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everybody.
See ya. Thanks, E. Thanks, Dan. Kevin, Mary.
Bye, everyone.